Afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm David Smith. I'm president of the Community Colleges chapter of the Fulbright Association. And welcome to Fulbright in the Curriculum. This is our chapter's way of honoring International Education Week with a series of 5 conversations during International Education Week to talk about community colleges, their students, and international education and efforts that are made to enhance the education experience for community colleges. I just want to remind everybody, and I will put it in the chat, that you can join our chapter. We are a virtual chapter, and I will put the website link in the chat, which includes joining our chapter and also getting on our mailing list. So with any further ado, I'm going to turn you over to Laurie Wolfe, who will be moderating this session. Thank you, Laurie.
Yes, thank you, David. And thank you, Vincent, for putting all of this together. I know a lot of work went into the back end of this, so want to recognize you before we begin. This session today is focused on institutional data, advocacy, and measurable student success. And I'm really excited to have everybody here. And Dr. Melissa Whatley is going to be talking to us about this topic. For community college leaders, faculty, and staff, demonstrating the impact of our work is critical. And this session is designed to give us all the evidence that we need to advocate for international education on our campuses. I'm honored to introduce a leading researcher who bridges the gap between global learning and institutional metrics. Please help me welcome Dr. Melissa Whatley, who will share with us vital data that directly links international education to measurable outcomes, such as student success and credential completion. So without any other ado, as David said, I would like to turn it over to you, Dr. Whatley, and thank you for being here with us.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here. I am going to share my screen. I've got some slides to share with you. Can everyone see this? Yes? Okay, awesome. So I am Dr. Melissa Whatley. I'm an assistant professor of higher education at William and Mary, and I am also the founder of the Community College International Education Research Initiative, which is also hosted at William and Mary. And I'm going to talk today a bit about community college international education and student success. So to get us started, I'm going to ask you all to interact a little bit. And we have actually got a small enough audience that we could do this without having to use breakout rooms or the chat or anything like that. I want to pose the question, what is international education? So when you think about international education, what comes to mind? And feel free to unmute yourself to share.
Well, I don't mind filling in the silence here.
I'm a professor, so I can be quiet for a long time. Wait for
Exactly.
the
You have to
answer,
wait people out. Uh, I think that for me, international education is a very broad term. It can mean a lot of things, but part of it is being able to incorporate different perspectives into your classroom. So not just like within the content of the curriculum, because of course, if we can, that's great to do, but also like the voices of the different students that are in the classroom and honoring their backgrounds and their perspectives.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? I'm seeing some action in the chat. Hold on, let me open it up here.
Here.
Uh, all right. So David is saying exposing learners to global and non-native based ideas, concepts, theories, and perspectives. Thank you, David.
And if I might add, yeah, definitely things beyond our immediate borders.
Yeah, thank you. So often when I ask this question, the answer that I get is something involving student mobility. So it's study abroad or international students coming to the United States, which you've sort of touched on in your responses. But I appreciate about this audience that you've expanded the definition of what international education is to include a diversity of approaches. And so the work that I'm going to share with you today focuses on that diversity of approaches. And this is a piece that I recently published that's called International Education's Academic Benefit Potential for Community College Virtual International Exchange. So I'm going to focus on virtual international exchange. I'm going to center virtual international exchange as the international education program that we'll be talking about today, but I'll also make some comparisons to study abroad, which is one of the ways of enacting international education that people often mention when I ask that question, what is international education? So an overview of this study. So as we know, and I imagine I don't have to say this to this audience, virtual international exchange programs have recently grown in prominence in U.S. higher education generally and at community colleges. We're talking about virtual international exchange a lot more now than we were, say, 5, 6 years ago, largely thanks to the pandemic. That's not to say that virtual international exchange did not exist before then, but it is the topic of conversation more frequently now. And this is for a good reason. These kinds of programs can reach more students. They have the potential to address significant equity issues in other areas of international education. And I'm thinking specifically about study abroad when I talk about equity issues. Um, but there's lots of questions that we still need to answer about virtual international exchange. So what is the benefit of these programs? How do they benefit students? How do they benefit communities, which is a specific focus of the community college? So the context of this study is one surrounding student academic success. So previous research and work has found a strong positive connection between study abroad and graduation or completion, and that is true both at four-year colleges and universities as well as in the community college world. Similar findings have been found for other measures of academic success. So things like transfer, for example, from in the community college context, GPA. I'm trying to think of some other accumulation of college level credits is another metric that has been used in the literature. So we know that study abroad has this positive relationship with academic success. There's some emerging evidence about this for virtual exchange. So in one study that was published in 2022, Lee and colleagues found that virtual exchange participation was related to an increased likelihood of graduation as well as higher GPAs. One of the limitations of this study, and this isn't necessarily intended to be negative about this particular study, all research has its limitations. One of the limitations of this study is that the data came from a single large university. And this university had made significant investment in virtual exchange as part of this broader internationalization strategy. So the extent to which these findings would transfer to other institutional contexts is questionable. So in the study that I'll share with you today, when I talk about virtual exchange, what I mean is, and I'll adopt O'Dowd's definition here, is engaging groups of learners in extended periods of online intercultural interactions and collaboration with partners from other cultural contexts or geographic locations. And I provide this definition here because the definition of virtual exchange can be a bit slippery, but the programs that are part of this study fall within this definition. And then study abroad is defined as short-term international mobility for which academic credit is earned. So I always say there has to be some sort of study component to study abroad. It can't just be travel abroad. There's some sort of academic purpose to the travel, which is often expressed through academic credit. So both virtual exchange and study abroad fall under this umbrella definition of high impact learning practices. And these practices foster what is called socio-academic integration, meaning that there's both a social component to what students are doing, but an academic component to what students are doing. And the socio-academic integration is thought to lead to better outcomes for students. Both virtual exchange and faculty-led study abroad, such as the programs that are included in this study, require significant student-faculty interaction, as well as interaction among students in their peer group. So these are small group experiential learning opportunities. And so that creates this integration of both a social component and an academic component to what students are doing. The difference between the two practices is that virtual exchange can happen at scale. So when we think about study abroad, we often talk about limitations in who can or cannot participate, who has the means to participate, etc. But there's also a supply side limitation. Only a certain number of faculty members are going to be willing to support and engage in study abroad, and you can only reasonably enroll a certain number of students in a study abroad program. And so virtual exchange has this potential to both reach a larger number of students in terms of accessibility for students, but it also can be much easier to implement from, say, the faculty or staffing perspective. It doesn't necessarily take as many resources. Not that it doesn't take resources, but those resources are different. So the purpose of this study is twofold. The first purpose is to explore the extent to which the average individual student benefits from virtual exchange and study abroad with reference to two student success outcomes, and those are credential completion and GPA. The second is to explore the extent to which student success improves in the aggregate as related to institutions providing these two experiences. And I know that second purpose may seem a little fuzzy right now, but we'll get into it as I continue talking. Similarly, there's two research questions that this study addresses. So the first one is, what is the average relationship between virtual exchange and academic outcomes? So again, looking at GPA and credential completion for an individual student. And then how does this compare to study abroad? Not that these two experiences are interchangeable, but because we often view them both as international education opportunities for students. And then the second question is, when we compare them to one another, which of these two international education opportunities accrues the greatest benefit, defined as the greatest increase in average cumulative GPA and probability of completion in a whole student body? So this question is really about that scalability of virtual exchange versus study abroad. So the data that I use for this study come from two community colleges. They're located in the US Southeast. Both of them have well-established international programs. These are not new virtual exchanges. They're not new study abroads. And these two community colleges represent two different community environments. One is located in a large urban area, and the other is a rural community college. I use administrative data from the two colleges. These are entering cohorts of students across 3 academic years, starting in the 2016-17 academic year until the 2018-19 academic year. I collected the data from institutions in summer 2021, which is why these are pre-pandemic years. Neither of these institutions were running study abroad programs at this point in time, so I had to stick to years prior to the pandemic. After some exclusions, I ended up with a data set of around 27,000 students that has information about student demographics, academics, and then international experiences. So this study adopts what's called a potential outcomes framework, and I hope that this is the most mathy and statisticsy of what I get into in this talk. You can ignore all the letters and notations in this image, but what I want you to focus on is what the counterfactual means. So what I'm really interested in this study is what happens with GPA and completion in what's called the counterfactual scenario that study abroad or virtual exchange does not exist. So we see this character Amy in this example here, and Amy has some depression symptoms, and they're at this certain mid-tier level over time, over to the left of that graph. Well, then she adopts a dog, and all of a sudden we see this solid red line that shows a decrease in these depression symptoms, right, after adopting the dog. So what a counterfactual scenario does is it asks the question, what would have happened to Amy in the event that she had not adopted the dog? So that situation is counter to fact, right? We know that Amy did adopt a dog, but what we really want to measure is that difference between the dotted line, the counterfactual, and the solid line. So what would have happened to Amy in the event she had not adopted a dog? As someone who has several dogs, this is the example that I absolutely wanted to put on this slide. So just hold that in your heads. That's what we're really interested in here. So if we look at some averages and percentages from the data, I've got here across the top row, you've got the different groups of students that are in the study. We have all students, those who did a virtual exchange, and those who studied abroad. And then at the end is the column for students who did neither experience. If we look at average last recorded cumulative GPA, we see that study abroad students have the highest, followed by virtual exchange, and then the none group has the lowest cumulative GPA average. The pattern is similar for credential completion. Study abroad participants have the highest rate, followed by virtual exchange, and then the students with neither experience are about the same as the full student group. This is promising, right? It suggests that both of these international education opportunities to promote this academic success among students. But the problem here is that there's selection bias. So we know that students who choose to study abroad are systematically different from the ones that choose not to, often in ways that may be related to their academic performance. So another way of saying this is that study abroad participants are already high performing academically even before they choose to study abroad. And those of you who work with students who go on study abroad programs know this already. The same is true for virtual exchange. Now, while virtual exchange may be something that students accidentally stumble into, meaning that they don't even know that it's part of a class when they sign up for it, what we do see in the broader landscape of virtual exchange is that virtual exchange programs are often embedded in classes where we may have higher performing students already. And so the virtual exchange programs themselves are not randomly distributed. So we've got selection bias in both cases. So in terms of analysis here, what we have are three what I'll call treatment conditions. So this is the equivalent of Amy getting the dog. Virtual exchange is one, study abroad is another, and then we have the comparison group of students who did neither. Again, we're looking at credential completion and last recorded GPA. And then I approach this from two analytic phases. So you'll remember that first research question that I asked was about the benefits of these experiences for an individual student. And I'm going to present both unweighted and weighted analyses. So unweighted analyses are just the raw data. There's nothing special going on with the data. The weighted analyses adjust for the likelihood that a student will choose virtual exchange or study abroad. So this is one way to account for the selection bias. Another way of saying this is that I trust the weighted analyses a bit more because we at least are attempting to address the fact that students who study abroad are already typically better performing academically. So that's the individual phase. What did I learn from the analyses in the individual phase? Well, if you see these stars, that is statistical significance. So that means that these are meaningful numerical results here. We see that, so for example, for study abroad, in the weighted model, so I'll turn your attention to the last two columns there. Students who studied abroad on average had a higher GPA of 0.32. And students who studied abroad had about a 50% increase in the likelihood of completion. Similarly, for virtual exchange, students who participated in a virtual exchange, their final GPA was 0.23 points higher. And then they had a greater likelihood of completion. That's not significant in the weighted models, but it is in the unweighted models. So that result is not quite as stable. For both experiences, the results are positive for students, but study abroad, generally speaking, if we're just comparing the numerical differences, study abroad seems to have better results if we're thinking about individual students. The second question that I asked in this study, on the other hand, though, was, when we're comparing these two experiences, it's not just the benefit to the individual student, but also benefit to the entire student body. So while study abroad may have these great benefits for the students who are able to participate, that doesn't mean that a lot of students are able to do that. So what about virtual exchange? So again, let's return to that potential outcomes framework. So I'm wondering, so what happens if, for example, we pretend that these two colleges don't offer study abroad? How would we expect the likelihood of completion for the entire student body to decrease? How much would we expect student GPA to decrease if we removed the possibility that students could either study abroad or participate in virtual exchange? And so what we can do is we can estimate what that number would be from the data. So what I have on the next slide, and this is your organizational slide to show you what you're about to see, because the next slide has lots of numbers and gets a bit complicated. So what we're asking here is what would have happened in the absence of virtual exchange or study abroad? And we can use the data to estimate counterfactual averages. So we'll have GPA and completion for the unweighted models and then GPA and completion for the weighted models. The first set will pretend that study abroad doesn't exist. The second set pretends that virtual exchange doesn't exist. And then we can do a comparison with the real data to see how much we would expect the average GPA or the average completion rate to decrease if we took away one of these two international learning opportunities. All right, so here are the results for that group phrase. So in the observed column, you have the real data. The counterfactual column is the estimated counterfactual for GPA or completion in the absence of study abroad or virtual exchange. One thing to note is that we see lots of stars, so the differences between the observed and the counterfactual are statistically significant. So for example, if we were to take away study abroad, what the unweighted models are telling us is that the average cumulative GPA of students would decrease by 0.0006. Now that's not very big, right? But it is statistically significant and it is a decrease. And we see that happening across all cases. So if we take away study abroad or we take away virtual exchange, there's a lower completion rate at these colleges and students have a lower average GPA. Another key takeaway from this slide is that the decrease, if we were to take away virtual exchange, is always larger. So if we look, for example, at the weighted models, if we were to take away virtual exchange, the average student GPA would decrease by 0.0029. So key takeaways here. So both study abroad and virtual exchange do have a positive relationship to student success. Virtual exchange seems to offer a greater return on investment in the aggregate. More students are participating, more students are benefiting, and it has this scalability component. So the question comes up, well, so should we just get rid of study abroad and favor this more accessible virtual international exchange? And my answer there is likely not. There are some students who are benefiting from study abroad. The estimated improvements are consistently higher for study abroad for the average participant. But what we are seeing is that virtual exchange has this benefit of being able to reach more students. So that is what I've got for you. I would love to hear your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that presentation. We have just a couple of prepared questions that I'd like to start with, and then we'll throw it out to other participants. So this first question, I think, applies to most of us, but I know in particular my college right now is struggling with tight budgets. Right. So everybody is sort of suffering right now with budget constraints, given that is often the limitation that, the reason we're given for not being able to do more with international exchange. What for you is the single most compelling, data-driven argument that we can make to our administration in support of investing in international education and global learning opportunities?
Well, so if we're thinking about particularly data-driven reasons, the study that I just presented should be compelling, right? We see this positive relationship between not just study abroad, but also virtual international exchange. So international programs generally have this positive relationship with student success. That's not unique to this particular study. That is something that we see consistently across the literature. It's true for community colleges, it's true for universities, it's true for liberal arts colleges, it's true across the board. And so we're seeing this consistent finding in data that students really benefit academically from these experiences. You look like
So, yeah, because I was just thinking about that. This counterfactual method is interesting, but do you have other studies, or are you aware of other studies that took a more experimental approach where somebody who didn't have virtual exchanges at all and then implemented them at their college, did they see a difference?
So I am not aware of any work out there that does that. And I
Well,
think
we
that
should do that.
we should do that. Yes, we should absolutely do that, where we have the scenario where over time virtual exchange did not exist and then we implement it and we can do a pre-post beforehand.
Right.
So if any of your colleges are in that sort of scenario and you also would like to give me access to data, let me know and we should talk.
I would like to collaborate on something like that because I'm
All
thinking
right.
of implementing virtual exchange in some of my classes.
Yeah, so I submitted a grant proposal to fund a randomized control trial last year and was not successful, but I am planning to reapply, where I was going to randomize virtual exchange. And so, same professor, same class, but some of the students had virtual exchange and others didn't, to see what would happen. So, but
I have ideas. Let's talk.
work along those lines would be really important for advancing this narrative, right?
Right, right. Yeah, I love that. We can connect afterwards.
Good.
The other question is like, so your research obviously links international education to student outcomes and specifically credential completion.
Yeah.
So how could a community college like best translate this data into a measurable objective that you could then tie back to strategic plans? Because my college too is right in the middle of revising our strategic plan. So everything is about how does this connect? How does this connect?
Yeah. So one thing I think that colleges can do is to just simply track student data over time. And I know that community colleges, especially in recent years, have gotten a lot better about this, in just connecting data from the International Education Office to the larger data set that the college collects. So all colleges are required to collect and report data about their students to the federal government.
Mhm.
Things like racial and ethnic identity, degree program, completion, etc., right? And many colleges collect a lot of other data in addition to what they're required to collect because it helps them connect to their strategic plan, helps them know if they're meeting metrics, etc. But what I often see at community colleges is the international education part of campus and the data collection part of campus aren't necessarily talking to each other. And it's not difficult, especially with recent advances in technology, to simply connect the two data sources. And so then not only do you know who studied abroad and who didn't, or who did a virtual exchange and who didn't, or which virtual exchange did they do, how long was the class that it was implemented in, etc. All of that information can then be combined with what we know about students' academic outcomes, for example. And that can really help to explore the extent to which international education is contributing to meeting these metrics that might appear in a strategic plan. So, I mean, this study, for example, is a result of me convincing these two colleges that they really needed to connect those two data sets. So.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Do other participants have questions they'd like to ask?
And again, I'm not going to be shy. I want to say thank you again, Dr. Whatley, for not just starting this data conversation around community colleges and international education. Thank you, Dr. Wolfe, for being such a great host and moderator. I'm also, again, was just incredibly awestruck about your work focusing on those first generation Pell eligible students and their engagement with study abroad. Again, being an institution, community college has open enrollment, and we do see our fair share of students who are zero EFC or or paying out of pocket or a variety of ways, but being able to talk to them around the benefits of taking this step to not just study abroad or engage it, even if it's virtual or the case may be, but to start thinking more, again, more globally. Can you speak to some of your, again, research you might know of or that you've been a part of to talk about its impact on those first generation socioeconomic income level students, Pell eligible, and the outcomes they can have?
Yeah, so, and Vincent, I think you're thinking about a study that I did that is a spin-off of this one. And so it is the same data set, but I broke the students out into Pell eligible and non-Pell eligible. So it's focusing specifically on that income status. And we know that Pell eligibility is not a perfect measure of income status, but it is often the best that we can do, right? I always say it's the higher education equivalent of free and reduced price lunch in K-12 research, right? It's not perfect, but it is usually the best metric we have. And what that study suggested was that, first of all, both student groups benefit equally from both study abroad and virtual exchange. It's not that, there's some reasons to think that perhaps higher income students participate more in international education because they have more to gain, right? That would be the economic rationale behind students' decision making about whether they're going to do something like a study abroad or a virtual exchange. But we see that both student groups benefit. And actually, if I'm recalling correctly, of course, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but like the numerical difference was not that different between the two groups. So they're benefiting essentially equally. Um, what we see at community colleges often is that lower income students are more likely to access international education compared to their non-Pell recipient peers. And especially for study abroad, I think that's because community college have spent years and years and years working on helping this lower income student group access opportunities like study abroad. There's been lots of focus and attention. And so that is evidence that those kinds of outreach to specific student populations really can work. It does help students see themselves as someone who can study abroad, who would benefit from study abroad. Um, we could think about how we might focus on other student populations that also could use similar kinds of outreach.
Other questions?
Yes, I have a follow-up question because again, I'm gonna take advantage of our folks here and people who watch this on video. They got to deal with me. Um, is there a opportunity in your study about its impact on faculty or staff or stakeholders in supporting this type of endeavor and efforts and that investments? Again, I love how you said it. Community colleges already have decades of looking after and supporting, particular student demographics. What impact does it have on someone coming into a community college environment or currently working in a community college environment as a faculty member or a staff member or a stakeholder?
Yeah, so I don't have the data that I would need to answer that kind of question right now. Higher education institutions, we tend to collect a lot of data about students, right? We care very much about what students are gaining from the different kinds of opportunities that we make available. There's less information about, say, faculty or staff or the adults who are leading the programs, right? What is the impact on them? But certainly, I mean, to your point, there's got to be an impact, right? I've talked to lots of community college faculty who the reason they themselves were able to travel abroad or that they themselves had conversations with people in other parts of the world is because they were implementing a virtual exchange program or a study abroad program. So there has to be some kind of impact as well. Yeah. Another direction for future research.
Anyone else? Not to silence Vincent's voice, but does anyone else want to ask a question or Vincent, another one?
I have a quick question
Yeah, Linda.
for Professor Whatley. Have you had a chance to share with the coordinators, directors of international education at these respective colleges from which you drew your data? What do they think of your study? What do they intend to do with your findings?
Yeah, so this study, these findings are actually at this point, so the article was published last year, and in academic publishing terms, that means that I finished the study 2 years prior to that. So it's been a while since I have shared these results with the directors of international education at these two community colleges. But what did happen is that they both took them to the results to their direct supervisor and said, hey, look, this is what our programs are doing, and use the results to advocate for their programs. And I would like to think that it worked. Both programs still exist. They're still very vibrant. They're well funded. And so, showing this kind of hard data to administrators can often go a long way.
I think it would be, a good selling point, your data, your results. Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. So, and both of these colleges have had international education for a long time.
Sure.
I don't know that international education was necessarily threatened to the extent that it is at other community colleges. But it's certainly motivation to keep those programs around because they are making really positive contributions to students' educational trajectories.
I know your arena is the community college, and thank you for selecting that arena. But do you think your study could easily be replicated in a four-year school setting?
It could, and it has. There's certainly large scale. In fact, the work in the 4-year sector is larger scale than what I've been able to do.
Oh, sure. Right.
So there's a project, it's called the CASI project, and I cannot remember what that acronym stands for other than that the I and the E at the end are international education. But it's a group of 4-year institutions that have pooled all of their data. So it's a very large data set, and have explored the impact. This Cassie is specifically focused on study abroad, but the impact of study abroad on these academic outcomes. Thank you, Vincent, for putting that link in the chat. So that's a link to a research brief that summarizes some of their results. I would love to do something similar with community colleges. It's a time and resource thing, so maybe one day.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions?
All right, so this is not so much a question, but it's also some of a promotion. We've had a lot of conversations this week talking about COIL. Like, and we're going to end our week talking with the UK Fulbright Commission, who actually has an award for faculty and a grant for faculty to develop COIL-based exchange programs where the faculty get to travel to one of their partner institutions. And so one of the things I'm thinking about, again, kind of beginning with the end in mind, are what are those data points to help people develop and utilize, because I think there are already some COIL projects that could be Fulbright ready. I think there are already folks who have great expertise in this area, but like how, again, could they leverage your research, Dr. Whatley, to promote their COIL program, or maybe even refine or even launch?
Yeah, so I mean, this research in particular, what it shows is that we have this positive impact on academic outcomes, right? Of course, there's a lot more to international education than just the academics. Academics is one component. And I'm actually currently working on a study. We're collecting data right now that looks at different characteristics of virtual exchange programs and how those relate to student outcomes. So, is there a certain length that we want the programs to be? What kinds of interactions do students need to have? How frequently do they need to have those interactions? What kinds of assignments are useful for collaboration? I think there's a lot that we just don't know about virtual exchange, and how that impacts student outcomes. And I bring up outcomes because this study is not actually looking at the academics. We're looking at the development of intercultural communication skills and how are students able to, that's an outcome that you could reasonably expect to have from virtual exchange. So how are students able to talk with and understand interactions with people who are from a different culture in a different part of the world? So that is some active research that I'm working on. I don't really have a good answer for you yet, but ask me again in a year or two, and maybe I'll have something more to say.
Anything else from anyone while we still have Dr. Whatley with us? Okay, well, I'm a
Again,
professor too, so I let like the silence.
no, listen,
Vincent?
you can close out. I just want to make sure we promote tomorrow. Again, we have Dr. Robin McCharles Helms from the Association of Community College Trustees talking about some of her workforce work and global education. And so that career and technical education piece. And again, maybe there's something else to think about the discipline. I like how you said too, Dr. Watley, around normally it's the high achieving students who are participating. What about those students who, again, might have some other engagements? Not saying that they have to be like lower performing, but like maybe they're not in the top, 10% of the class or the 25% of the class. How are some of their outcomes? But I like how this with like I think Dr. Charles Helms is gonna talk about tomorrow is really expanding the reach of in a competency-based education way. around international education and engagement.
Great.
But I'll put
And
in the chat for those who have registered.
for people who are watching the recording, then all of these different sessions will be posted on the website. So once this one's
Yes.
posted, they should be able to find those other ones as well.
Mhm.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Especially thank you, Dr. Whatley, for presenting your research on this, and Vincent, again, for putting this all together. It was wonderful. I'll linger a little in case people have questions or want to chat, but otherwise, yeah, if you want to come back and look at this later, just for your own reference, we'll have it posted on the website, hopefully sometime later next week, I think is the goal.
Well, thank you so much for having
Right.
me. This was lots of fun.
Yes, thank you. And I think we do have each other's email addresses already from Vincent, but I would love to talk to you about some kind of collaboration because I have been thinking about doing some kind of virtual exchange, and we have nothing right now. We have literally no international education department, no study abroad programs, zero. So, but we have a lot of data on student outcomes. So we could implement something and then do a pre and post.
Well, let's find a time to chat, and thank
Yeah. I'll send you an email and we'll figure something out.
sounds great.
All right. Thank you, everybody else, for coming. We appreciate it.
All
Bye,
right.
everybody. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. All right.
Everything else going well, Vincent?